Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Tout d'abord, je souhaite vous remercier pour votre participation aujourd'hui à cette première session des journées scientifiques de la chaire Résilience et Leadership. Alors, pour reprendre les propos du professeur Lebris, qui a introduit la session d'ouverture, les 3 demi-journées viseront à mettre en discussion les mondes académiques et pratiques autour des thématiques de résilience et leadership en confrontant des enseignements et recherches qui ont été issus de domaines scientifiques avec des témoignages et expériences vécues par des décideurs lors de leur gestion de crises diverses. Nos 3 demi-journées se différencieront notamment par les contextes qui y seront traités, et nous commençons aujourd'hui par aborder le domaine industriel. En premier lieu, nous aurons l'honneur d'écouter le professeur Woods, qui nous présentera ses travaux de recherche sur la différence entre les systèmes fragiles et résilients. David Woods est professeur émérite au département d'ingénierie des systèmes intégrés de l'Université d'Ohio. Il est notamment connu pour ses travaux sur l'ingénierie de la résilience, ou The Resilience Engineering, ayant mené au livre éponyme, qui est une référence pour tout chercheur ou praticien travaillant sur ces questions. Ces travaux l'ont mené à étudier divers terrains d'investigation, allant du domaine aéronautique, avec l'analyse de l'accident de l'Airbus 447 Rio-Paris, au domaine spatial, à travers l'étude de l'accident de Columbia, en étroite collaboration avec la NASA. Il est aussi membre de plusieurs associations de recherche et a gagné divers prix pour sa longue implication pour enrichir ce domaine de connaissances. Alors, le professeur Woods a une petite vidéo qu'il souhaiterait nous soumettre en live, et donc on va l'écouter. Professeur Woods, c'est à vous.
It's wonderful to be with everyone today. My work with the institutions of France began in 1980, actually, when I worked with Electricity de France in the aftermath of the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident. And since I have worked with a variety of French organizations after other shock events. We have the shock today of the pandemic, but this is the latest, perhaps the most global, of a long series of events which shake up different industries and shake up our attitudes and understanding of the world around us. I will try to run through today some of the latest scientific results that go behind the label, very popular label of resilience, to understand the fundamental findings and new ideas that explain our world, how adaptive capacity is necessary, how we lose it, how we sustain it. And I will use some examples from French history. So with that, Thibault, can we please start the talk?
What makes the difference between brittle or resilient systems? Well, we're understanding more and more about the distinction, and we can do more and more to focus on how to produce systems that can demonstrate resilient performance when change and challenge happens. But brittleness is still an epidemic across our societies, our organizations, and our technology. So we're going to do a little bit of a tour of the fundamentals, and we're going to do that by starting in some ways at the beginning, at least the exploration of myself and many of my colleagues of this topic. And we're going to try to use that to point some of the ways that we might start to be able to steer more strategically and be more responsive in a changing world. And I think that's related to many of the things we want to discuss about how we emerged from the pandemic, how we've adapted to cope in the context of the pandemic. Now, the picture you're looking at is a drone damaged, a case of brittle autonomy. And this exploration started, right, when 3 space explorations failed in 1999. And that failure history started to highlight complexity penalties 21 years ago. What did the independent investigation of these breakdowns tell us? Increasingly brittle systems under faster, better, cheaper pressure. Increasingly brittle. Unappreciated brittleness was accumulating until there was a sudden collapse in performance when events challenged system boundaries. So descriptively, brittleness is a boundary phenomenon and very separate from how well a system may perform when it's operating far from the boundaries. So we can get good statistics on availability or reliability because we're looking across the full range rather than understanding what happens when events challenge boundaries. And limited resources and ongoing processes of change, as life keeps reminding us in our context today, that the challenges to boundaries are visible and more frequent. So in 2000, the question arose on NASA, could organizations build and sustain sources of resilient performance? And I claimed that we both absolutely need to, and that we can, engineer resilience in complex systems. To which my audiences and colleagues said, what's resilience engineering? My response was, how to be prepared to be surprised, right? So they were asking this after a shock in '99. And oh, by the way, remember in 2000, we didn't respond very well. In 2003, we had another shock with the Columbia Space Shuttle accident that triggered, again, a round of exploring and developing resilience engineering. And so I was coming back and saying, we should be looking before the shock, right? And then we might appreciate better during a shock event how to handle it. How to be prepared to be surprised. Well, what was their reaction? What? What could that mean? It's a surprise. You can be prepared to be surprised? Well, actually, what I was bringing up was old. Little did I know until a few years later, Samuel de Champlain had demonstrated this capability sailing the North Atlantic and launching the development of Canada in the early 1600s. He crossed the North Atlantic multiple times successfully in that time period, as well as interacting with new peoples, nations, right, in an exchange of culture and an exchange of products and initiation of a North Atlantic trade, international trade, of revolutionary, accelerating processes of change. When he reflected on why he was successful, why he was able to pull off so many things a few years later, he said it was due to prévoyance. Except this word doesn't match how my French friends use the word today. And it doesn't, and the English translation doesn't match the way we use those English words today either. What did Champlain mean when he said it was prévoyance? It was the ability to prepare for the unexpected in a world of danger, trade-offs, and uncertainty, right? As another French explorer, a Jesuit, a few years later would say, living in the Northeast North America, to save ourselves from danger, we had to confront dangers all around. So trade-offs, risk, and fundamental uncertainty. And yet he was able to chart paths, right, and revise paths in the face of that uncertainty and risk. Well, what about now? Well, let's take the US just now. In February, the entire large state of Texas energy system collapsed. Not completely as bad as it could have collapsed, but still an enormous crisis, an epic failure of resilience and leadership. In fact, right, the energy system was designed to maximize efficiency, right, and extract money in the energy business. And brittleness was irrelevant, how brittle it was. In fact, brittleness could be a source of great profit to some of the companies. Or we just had it with a cyber event on a pipeline that produced widespread gas shortages and gas price spikes. A whole bunch of things going on, right? Again, people recognizing that an emphasis only on efficiency, only on optimization, inevitably eats at the sources of resilience, a basic trade-off that we have found fundamentally in understanding complex systems and how they adapt. So where are we since 2000? Complexity penalties arise from the development and deployment of new capabilities and new technology. These complexity penalties limit or put a ceiling on the performance that we aspire to. and they increase risks, safety risks, viability risks to organization by increasing brittleness. Our current methods for developing and deploying new technology in particular does not address complexity penalties. In fact, it adds to them. But the good news is the science foundations continue to develop on how adaptive systems work. And that can lead us to, and has been leading us to, new pragmatic techniques, systems engineering and otherwise, that allow us to outmaneuver complexity. As the pandemic has reminded us, we are all players in the story, not observers or analysts outside the story. And as players in the story, we bring limited models and bounded perspectives. So what's the fundamental complexity penalty, the fundamental signature, right, of our accelerating, increasingly interdependent world? Something that Samuel de Champlain experienced, right, those centuries ago against the backdrop or benchmark of where society stood in 1600. The key fundamental finding is we see over and over again a surprising, even shocking, sudden collapse against a backdrop of continuous improvement and new capabilities, right? And so we see this as my colleague John Doyle with Gene Carlson said 21 years ago, right? Systems are robust to the perturbations or disturbances they were designed to handle, yet fragile to unexpected ones and design flaws or limits. So it's highly competent within an envelope of designed for variation and uncertainty, and yet very vulnerable, right, to sudden large failure, right, in the face of events that go beyond that envelope. And what that means is, as a fundamental finding, that the pursuit of optimality increases brittleness unless we do certain things. And that trade-off of pursuing optimality and brittleness is a fundamental characteristic of this universe. There's even a proven theorem about it, right? So these are not optional things we can escape from. These are hard constraints on how our world works. Yet, right, biology and other human systems demonstrate ways we can do the unless, right? We can avoid brittleness and build resilience.
Whether looking through lenses of chemistry, biology, or sociology, more elaborate things build up through the combining of existing things, resulting in hierarchies of organizing. In an article titled Graceful Extensibility, David Woods calls these self-organizing hierarchies tangled, layered networks, a label that highlights their messiness, providing a contrast to the neat taxonomies and org charts we often use to describe them. Within these tangled layered networks, selection is going on everywhere at multiple levels simultaneously. Michael?
What we see there in a found animation, I didn't know this was being created by Sue Borsha, but we certainly take advantage because she explained the idea of tangled layered networks better than I normally do. And yet another one is this pressure we were referring to. That the pressure on faster, better, cheaper, right, increases the goal conflicts, increases the problem with prioritizing one goal over another, right, under different conditions. It leads people to adapt in a variety of ways. And how do those adaptations add up to making a more resilient system, or do they add up to making a system that is patching holes and bridging gaps one after another, creating a system that is more ad hoc and more brittle and fragile in the face of challenge? So we summarize this as a crisis of complexity, right? Where the tangled layered network says our technical area is layered networks. And this combines knowledge from many, many different fields. And these layered networks, or tangled layered networks, have extensive and hidden interdependencies. Right, the pictures on the top of the slide on the left is the tangled layered network for a very successful software company who tried to map the interdependencies in their products and in what they build as infrastructure to support their products and expand their products. It becomes a spaghetti of a tangle of interconnections. And yet on the right, you see, this is a successful company that's growing. And as it grows, new challenges, every new capability leads to new relationships, new interdependencies, and unfortunately, new surprises and anomalies. Failure is due to brittle systems. Systems as designed are more brittle than stakeholders realize, but fail less often as people in various roles, some people in some roles, adapt to fill the shortfalls and stretch the system's performance at the boundaries in the face of smaller and larger surprises. So that's a basic finding about how complex systems work and how adaptive systems work. What does that mean? It means systems are inherently messy, as her animation showed, right? People become the key element to build resilient performance. And this is what we refer to in the many different ways we use the word resilience as extensibility. It's an essential characteristic in the biological and human scope for systems to succeed despite their design. As the visual says, right, a found sign. We found it somewhere in the world. This system was never broken. It was built this way. Why do things end up that way? Finite resources and continuing change. We all have finite resources as we develop things. We try to manage those. We try to invest them wisely, pursuing our goals. And as we showed earlier, when we're successful, that only accelerates the changes going on. Pressure, right? Pressure to achieve goals played out in those NASA accidents in 1999 and 2003. And they were part of the recent brittle collapses, particularly the energy collapse in Texas under cold weather. By the way, in that case, just as a reminder, cold snaps across Texas that severe happen about every 10 years. It happened 10 years earlier, and the reports about how to change the system in order to be more effective didn't produce much actual change. Snafu is normal. Now, snafu is an interesting coinage. It comes from World War II. It comes from American frontline soldiers. Situation normal, all fucked up. That's right. That's exactly what it stands for. Right? That no matter what we do and how well we plan and how we work, this universe, that messiness will come back to haunt us in surprise, anomalies, and exceptions that we have to adapt to be able to handle. So the key idea behind all this is that in our universe, being poised to adapt is an essential capability. So where are we at? Brittleness is a fundamental risk that is undertreated in most systems. However, in biology, right, adaptive systems develop means to mitigate that risk. And we find success stories in human technology systems, in human cognitive systems, and in human social systems under many different kinds of studies that have been done out there. So yes, there are many, many different ways we use the word resilience today. But what the key definition to pay attention to is not which one you should use for resilience. Rather, it's what's adaptive capacity. How are we poised to adapt? That means we have a readiness or potential to change how a system currently works. The models behind it, the plans it has, the processes that go on, the technologies, the algorithms, the automation, how it behaves in different circumstances. We have to be able to change how it currently works to fit changing situations, anomalies, and surprises. Ultimately, surprise is always going on, and it's not about frequency. It's not the frequency of the events, rather it's about how the surprise, right, challenges the boundaries of how we designed the system to work, how we thought it worked. What we wanted it to do turns out to be limited, and our understanding of how it works is limited. And the world tells us about those limits by throwing anomalies and surprises at us. Now, responding to surprise, as in Champlain's case, required preparatory investments that give you the potential to be adaptive in the future when other kinds of events, unexpected things challenge you. That means you have to have a readiness to revise and a readiness to respond in advance of the actual experience of challenges at the boundaries. So first off, when Champlain talked in 1632 about prévoyance, he went much further than just talking about that as a preparatory orientation to be ready. He talked about some of the kinds of specifics he did in order to be able to respond effectively, to revise his understanding of what was going on, who he was interacting with, and to change and develop courses of action that could advance his goals. Into modern context, what this tells us is that paradoxically, systems can be competent and brittle. In fact, many of our systems, as we've illustrated in these brief examples, are competent and excessively brittle. And that competence can be measured in a variety of standard statistics. They might have a software that's highly reliable or highly available. And yet, we have these kinds of brittleness at the boundaries, that first complexity penalty, that basic one we talked about. Well, being poised to adapt leads us to a sense of resilience. The discovery that when we pursued resilience, what we found was a property that everybody had kind of missed, a general capability that has to be everywhere. Graceful extensibility, the capacity to stretch near and beyond the boundary when surprise occurs. It's the opposite of brittleness, and it trades off with the pursuit of optimality. How did we find it? By looking at how people adapted to build resilient performance in places where surprise is tangible, like emergency medicine, intensive care units, how they handle mass casualty events, space operations, well, and many, many other settings, right? Places where surprise happens and people adapt in these to compensate for the seas of complexity that they operate in, like Champlain. Whether this is a medical setting, a transportation or aviation setting, coping with extreme weather challenges like wildland firefighting, different kinds of settings that represent the organizations we've gathered together in this meeting. But why talk about the US and Texas or gas pipelines? We're all experiencing a stress test of adaptive capacities at all levels of society across the globe in our pandemic. A rolling series of outbreaks of a virus well adapted to hijack our physiology, challenge our physiology. It challenges how critical care medicine was set up. It challenges emergency medical systems. It has challenged our ability to intervene because of the lags between being exposed or infected and when symptoms show. A lag where you're contagious but don't realize it, maximizing this potential spread. It has highlighted otherwise hidden interdependencies that were operating extensively in the background. Right? It's revealed unappreciated excess brittleness in systems across all aspects of our societies. It's exposed societal asymmetries as certain groups took on much greater risk. Frontline medical staff, care home staff, and essential workers providing the supplies so that we could stay home or work from home during the pandemic. We've seen fragmentation across units, organizations, jurisdictions, and nations, right? And we see how this is all playing out locally, regionally, and continentally in parallel. Cross-role, cross-layer interdependencies everywhere. In thinking about what Champlain experienced in crossing the North Atlantic to the St. Lawrence River, right? He was facing, for certain, uncertainty. That was the thing he knew most for sure, was that uncertainty would be dominating the situation. And of course, in the spring, that was the headlines. The only certainty in the pandemic is the uncertainty. The fundamental novelty of the virus and the way it had impacted the world, but also the way it impacted, that revealed things that we didn't understand or didn't want to understand about how our societies worked. It revealed the three basic ways adaptive systems fail. They can't They saturate, they run out of capacity to continue to adapt. They can't keep up with the pace or tempo of change. Right? And so instead of compensating for the changing conditions and disturbances, they decompensate. They run out of capability. They can't keep pace. Or they work across purposes rather than coordinate and synchronize their activities. And we see that in the fragmentation within our societies and across societies. And we see how we get stuck in stale plans, things that used to be effective but no longer apply in the new situation. The getting stuck in stale approaches and models, right, leads us to retreat, blocks updating and revision. Right? And instead of learning and approaching things in new ways to match the new problems and challenges, we retreat into old ways of responding. So let's think through the pandemic for a minute as we lead into our discussions. And here are 4 pairs of questions, right? And they are, right, related to a shock. As an American boxer is reputed to have said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. So, when your organization is punched in the mouth, was punched in the mouth, will be punched in the mouth, what are the questions to ask? Well, the first pair is, where is their brittleness in response to the shock? And where is their, quote, resilience in response to the shock? Both will be revealed when there's a significant challenge to your system. What roles are acting to support the front lines, the roles that directly confront the disruptions and have to respond to those disruptions most visibly, most tangibly? Right. Well, what are the roles supporting the frontline roles? And oh, by the way, given the shock, maybe those front lines moved. Right? All of a sudden, management in hospital systems became clinical specialists under time pressure. They weren't just administrators working about efficiency and planning future construction or resources or incorporating medical advances into their clinics. What roles, the pair question is, what roles are acting to constrict and hobble the front lines? Who's supporting, right? And who's hobbling those at the sharp end of responding to the shock event? The third pair, when you get punched in the mouth and the plan goes out the window, is what's not surprising about this and what is surprising. There will be a mix of novelty, right? But also the surprise was anticipated by other kinds of events. Now, when we're in the middle of it, the amount of novelty, the potential novelty, will be much, much greater than the novelty we actually determine months later when everything is over. But during it, much more is uncertain. Again, as Champlain pointed out to us so long ago. Some things weren't surprising because there had been dress rehearsals. There had been events that were similar. There were events that produced similar challenges. What happened to the learning from these precursors or other early signals that things were different than we thought, that the world worked differently than we imagined? So in the pandemic, right, where did the resilient performance come from? Some people took initiative. They built new forms of reciprocity across roles. This happened in the clinical level, where people reached out to colleagues around the world. What are you seeing? What's working for you? What shouldn't I do? As they rapidly tried to learn about the novelty of the disease and how to treat it. When we're punched in the mouth, how do we respond? Do we respond with coordination, synchronization, reciprocity, and solidarity across our roles and levels in society? Or do we respond with fragmentation, driven by selfishness and the ability to exploit the situation for that organization's or individual's gain? Before the storm, times were quiet, right? No, they weren't. Extreme weather events propagate. We depend more and more on critical digital services which break down, as in the pipeline case in the US recently. NASA's had incidents and disasters. Boeing's fiasco in 2018 and 2019, killing 346 people unnecessarily. Why doesn't brittle collapse happen more often? Because ultimately we rely on people to be the ad hoc source of resilient performance as graceful extensibility. People will do it. Some people in some roles will do that. And we saw that in many, many different roles where people stood up and took the risk, took the extra burdens in order to provide healthcare or to provide essential services. When brittle collapse is visible, how did we miss it? How did we miss the early signs? How did we not prepare? How did we get it so wrong? Through discounting and oversimplifications. Will people learn from this experience of brittle collapse? Well, there's a tension that we'll explore probably in our discussions. Some will retreat into those old models, those stale models. Others will pursue a new understanding, right? They will be oriented to reconfigure, re-examine how they understand the world and try to renew the way they do things in pursuit of key goals. Now we can understand this process of, what did we just talk through? Losing prévoyance. The not Champlain that was so visible in so many parts of the societal's response in the pandemic. But we've seen this many times before over the years in different organizations and industries, right? The line I used is, the future is implausible. That's before the surprise or shock event. Once the shock event happens, we look back, the past is incredible. How could they have missed what we all see now with hindsight as being the most important priority, the key information, right? Beforehand, complexity makes it implausible that this one thing will turn into a problem. We're too busy. We've got these other pressures. We'll fall behind in production. We'll lose out to competitors. All of these are oversimplifications in the face of how complex worlds work. So a shock event produces dissonance. And that dissonance comes because the model of the world, your model of the world and how it worked and your role in it, turns out not to match the world you're really in. So how do you respond? Do you try to preserve your old model, repair it? Do you retreat and retrench in the old model and the old ways of doing things? Or do you revise and rethink how you understood your world, understood your role in that world, understood the goals that were the priority? Do you reconfigure how you work and how you work together to renew on the basic values and goals? That's the key question we're exploring. Well, it turns out there's ways to make this work, right? And the key in this, to avoid the discounting or rationalization, right, that allows you to miss the warning signs of the shock, right, or to rationalize and minimize change afterwards instead of responding constructively. We make progress by studying intensely, carefully how we adapt to cope with complexity, so that we can see and anticipate, show prévoyance and anticipating the emerging signals and turning them into action, right? And we can extend prévoyance by looking backwards and using the information on how we coped with it, some areas of brittleness, some areas of resilience, to revise, given the lessons from the responses to past surprises. What that means is one of the biggest things that's moving forward, and we see this in some of the places where resilience engineering is happening as a pragmatic set of actions, right, is we start to track events that stress the system to reveal and shift the edges or boundaries in the system, because where we thought they were, they really aren't, that require some role or process to stretch, to gracefully extend in order to accommodate the effects or to even seize opportunities. Now the issue is, in a complex world, there's another characteristic that matters here. There's a difference between how the system actually works and how we think the system works. But that difference is only visible in the anomalies, exceptions, and surprises that occur, and in the responses to handle these. So if we want to understand resilient performance, we learn right? And gain and are allowed to revise. That readiness to revise comes from looking carefully to see challenges, right? What hits the edges? What kinds of scenarios represent those general forms of challenge that reveal edges? That tests our capabilities, our readiness to respond, our ability to stretch. For example, we study that in beyond surge events in emergency medicine. For example, a case where nearly 500 people were burned in a single accident in Taiwan. And that allows you to then understand how, where we stretch in unanticipated situations, right, we can now understand the stress and how to handle those and build the mechanisms to handle those scenarios. So edges, stretching, stress. That trinity and exploring that trinity allows us to understand resilient performance. What does that mean? Right? It means if you have new technology, we're going to look ahead and say, how will that change, produce new stresses, move the edges around, require new or extend, change the forms of stretching that go on. If we're looking at today, what are the ongoing stresses? What edges are they revealing? Where are the hidden stretches, right? Where people are demonstrating graceful extensibility, but the very fact they're adapting to handle the stress hides the stress and the edges from outside observers. Or we can look back and reveal, right, and use past accidents to see the stresses that revealed edges and see what are the real sources that gave us the capability to extend gracefully to handle them. Graceful extensibility, right, depends on more than just prévoyance as a kind of anticipation. Right? It's related to many other properties we're beginning to understand more and more about effective adaptive systems. Systems that need to have initiative. They have to be able to revise and reframe their understanding of the situation as events unfold. They have to be able to act ahead of or keep pace with the tempo of events. Graceful extensibility includes the ability to synchronize across roles, to coordinate across levels. That means how the different roles govern the expression of initiative. We can't go off on our own and whatever seems best locally at any given moment. We have to build reciprocity across roles so we help each other when challenges threaten to overwhelm our capacity to respond. And we have to be able to learn and see more than we can see by ourselves by contrasting and shifting perspectives across the different roles and levels. Similarly, we avoid the brittleness and the forms of adaptive system breakdown by continuous learning, a kind of proactive learning. We don't react after the shock event. We learn and see from smaller surprises and incidents, right, how things are going on. And we have techniques to overcome discounting and retreat, whether before or after shocks. We facilitate updating and revision of our models. We recalibrate our models of how they work to build a system that is poised to adapt. Right? Preparatory investments create the potential for adaptive action in the future. It builds a readiness to revise. Those three things we just went through, build our readiness to revise and our readiness to respond in advance of when challenges occur at the boundaries. Now this is very pragmatic. Well, one example I ran through was the stress edge stretch testing. And that deconfounds our ability to measure reliability, robustness, and resilience, which are really three different properties of our systems. The world of critical digital services is using and advancing these kinds of techniques, including these and other forms of testing, to understand the hidden interdependencies and to be prepared to respond when they come to the fore in a particular incident. And there's even new startup companies that have been that are growing, providing new kinds of tooling and techniques for actual working organizations to do these things. We've done new kinds of resiliency trade space studies about autonomous technology, drones for NASA, to take a deployment of new autonomy, which turns out to add brittleness in new places, and instead design it as a network, as a layered network that builds resiliency. We've worked with people, for example, David Provan in Australia, to redesign the safety manager role for working organizations, to take on this approach of guiding continuous adaptability rather than focus merely on compliance with rules. And we've even gone so far, we can write equations that tell you how to design a human automation system, for example, in aviation, to have more resilient control that will eliminate certain kinds of incidents that still plague us in highly automated systems. Samuel de Champlain demonstrated prévoyance, that ability to prepare for the unexpected, but he demonstrated much more about what generates resilience performance, both strengths and limits if we really want to dig in. You know, he lived in a world where the pace of change was accelerating. Well, our pace of change has accelerated as well, and our capabilities to be prepared to be adaptable, right, to be poised to adapt, must accelerate in order to keep pace with accelerating change in our world, right? That's what this little graph shows, right? A strategic agility gap where the quality improvement trajectory, as technical progress in many areas goes on, we are improving our systems and our organizations. But that trajectory happens too slowly relative to the pace of societal change and societal needs. We need a way to build that strategic agility of organizations and our societies, accelerate that trajectory to try to move closer to keeping pace with the change out there. That requires a paradigm shift, right, that was anticipated, right, in Champlain's reference to prévoyance as being a critical ingredient to behave effectively and strategically in an uncertain and dangerous world. So what's the difference between organizations who will retreat from complexity and emphasize working to plan, working to roll, working to rule, who will respond to failure by reinforcing working to plan and just try to repair a few cracks, paper over a few cracks? What are they? They're guaranteed to be slow and stale in responding to change and opportunities. They will remain fragmented across silos, reacting to surprise instead of anticipating it. They will assume they understand the world very well when they actually misunderstand and miss the signals that they misunderstand the world around them. Organizations that outmaneuver complexity are skilled at making changes regularly. They're skilled at snafu catching. Right? They're skilled at building up the ingredients for graceful extensibility by being able to be proactive in their learning, by being able to synchronize across roles, and being able to demonstrate that basic anticipatory skill and prévoyance. They assume their models can be wrong, that they will be wrong in ways that matter eventually, and they enhance their capability to update and revise. They are poised to adapt. Thank you very much.
Your microphone, please.
Alors, merci beaucoup, Professeur Woods, pour votre présentation extrêmement riche et inspirante. Merci beaucoup aussi pour les références françaises lors de votre présentation. Et l'exemple du navigateur Samuel de Champlain est très parlante sur cette capacité de prévoyance, d'être prêt à être surpris, à être déstabilisé par un environnement qui devient de plus en plus complexe et incertain. Donc, avant de laisser la parole à Jean-Michel Gauthier, je vous demande si vous avez peut-être des éléments que vous voudriez rajouter assez rapidement, Professeur Woods.
Thank you. I hope people were able to follow the talk. I tried to go slower. I am getting older and slowing down as well in a world of multiple languages. It's interesting. We tend to think of where we are today and the shock we are living through and the uncertainty as the world changes as we come out of the pandemic, hopefully sooner and faster and more globally is all of our wish. But the reminder of that other periods of dramatic change have gone on and people have adapted. And we can learn from those cycles and spirals of challenge and adaptation, of discovering new opportunities, of reconfiguration and renewal. I think the discussion and other parts of our time together over these days is focused on this idea of how do we reconfigure and pursue an open and growing future, not just simply recover to where we were in the aftermath of the pandemic. There's a line I've used for a long time about safety in complex systems, that the extra investment in safety is most needed when least affordable. And that certainly is the challenge we all face in safety management, but in all forms in our companies and organizations. The shock event, the surprise, restricts and eats resources, yet the opportunity to reconfigure and renew says we need to invest in new ways. And the key thing in this is to reorganize or reconfigure what we do, why we do it, right? What's the key priorities? So it really is a process of fundamental change. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, professeur Woods. Alors, on va laisser une discussion plus tard avec quelques questions qu'on va essayer de collecter au fur et à mesure et qu'on soumettra à la table ronde plus tard pour une discussion plus large avec nos intervenants qui sont là aujourd'hui avec nous.